Need to sit up straight.
Need permission for the slide.
Y'all do?
Not if you slide, do you?
Were you able to pull it up?
I had to switch to my other account, to my RSS account. Oh, yeah, it does say.
Let me go back and see. Don't look at the desktop. Just don't look. It might make you dizzy.
It does.
I can't see this right here. It's too small. Okay, let me resend this link and then let me know if that works better. Oh, you can just
You don't have
refresh,
to
right?
resend it, yeah.
Yeah.
Refresh and
Refresh
resend.
it.
You said it's good, cool?
Yes,
Okay.
it
Now you can look, the screen is hidden. Okay, so today the big focus for our meeting will be to look at some best practices. The first task that I had to do with my class dealt with looking at students and the student achievement. This class we're rolling over and looking into teacher leadership, so more of a focus on teachers, but the teacher leadership within the school and then teacher leadership within the teachers' classrooms, as I was sharing this morning with the group. That link there is the sign-in link for the document that Joy created. So when you sign in, you just put an X in the slot for, oh, no. You sign in with your name and then today's date. So, I'll leave it there for a few seconds, or you can access it from your screen if you need to sign in. Okay, while you're doing that, I have some good news. For our class, we submit our documents and assignments through TaskStream, which is the DPI site, and then we also submit our work to Gardner Webb. So for the DPI submission, I got a 4.0. I'm so proud. And then for Gardner Webb, my average is a 96. So I just wanted to share that good news. So, the team, as I stated when we first started talking about the PLCs, I feel like it's a team effort, so it's not the Cassandra show, it's not my ideas. I bring forth the ideas that I get from the research, but we're still working as a team. Whenever it moves to being the Cassandra show, then we've lost track of our focus. The focus is a team approach, a team discussion, so I just want to reiterate that piece. So thank you. And before we go on to looking at some best practices and coming up with a plan of what we want to look at as we observe the best practices in the classroom, I want to look at our update on looking at observing using the manipulatives with the problem-solving journals. We had a meeting March 15th, if I'm not mistaken, that date was, and we divvied out the grade levels amongst the leadership team and wanted to look at what we were seeing when we did class visits or walkthroughs. So we can start with sharing that. Anyone? Oh, we can go in order.
For
Okay, go ahead.
specifically for problem of the day, and is that what you're?
Yes. We were looking specifically at problem of the day, looking to see if the teachers were using manipulatives when they're doing problem of the day. We specifically wanted to look to see if they're doing the CRA, concrete representational abstract. And then we also wanted to look at their use of Freckle. And then that third component that we were looking at was lesson plans. But the meeting on the 15th, we talked about looking at the problem of the day and the use of Freckle.
Say that I was in, 5th grade, and for problem of the day, they were using representational and, abstract. I did not see manipulatives for the problem of the day. there were manipulatives in the classroom in stations and centers, but I didn't specifically see, problem of the, manipulatives for problem of the day, but there was great representational drawings and, abstract.
I can say I've seen it in second grade, and walking through and observing them that, you know, the manipulatives are, the kids know exactly what to do. And time is given in order for them to, you know, manipulate them to actually put it down. If they don't get it, at that time, for the kids who got it right off and they did the writing piece and that stuff, they actually are able to move into Freckle to start an assignment.
Okay.
And the kids who are not, they come to the floor with the teacher and she walks them through it on the board as far as like, what were you thinking, how did you get this, for them to actually get a better understanding of how to solve it.
And I noticed in second grade also, they're not all using the same manipulative to work problems, so they're using different children are using different manipulatives to solve the same problem, so they've obviously been trained on using multiple.
That's good, because they're using the manipulatives that work best for them, and not necessarily from days of the old, when the teachers would show a student how to do a problem and would say, you have to use these manipulatives, so that's a plus.
And I'm typically down in kinder quite often. I can't say that I've seen a lot of manipulatives used for their problem of the day, when it comes to that piece. I can see it used in like their teaching of the lesson and stations, but not their journals or the problem of the day.
I think they do more representation,
Mhm.
drawing the pictures than actually getting the manipulative out.
Mm-hmm.
For, in Moses's class, in the 5th grade class, we don't have to say teachers' names either, I can't say that, but in the 5th grade class that I've been working in, I've modeled using manipulatives. I've done 2 model lessons in the 5th grade class, but I have not been back in to see her, using the manipulatives outside the modeling because I was out of town most of last week. Then I also modeled using manipulatives in a kindergarten classroom, so I'll follow up this week with going back, next week with going in to see if there is, continued use of manipulatives.
I can say after you did your model lesson for the 5th grade class, I also had to go in and do an observation too. There was a use of manipulatives once you did your modeling.
And I will say, after we met, with the BTs, the question did come up, if the children don't need to use the manipulatives, do we have to basically force them to use the manipulatives? And my response was, if the child is developmentally where they need to be, and they move past that concrete stage and they don't need the manipulatives, they still should be doing the representation and the abstract. But even with that question being asked in the back of my mind, I wondered how many students are really ready to move straight to the abstract or even move to the representation without the concrete. And this may be just my personal opinion or what I'm wondering if it deals with the comfort level of the teachers to use those manipulatives, so they're going straight to the pictures and straight to the traditional algorithms. I do know we still have some of that in the building, so I wanted to answer the question and not say that you have to forcefully make all of the students use the manipulatives. If you have a student who is a higher level student and they understand it, they've mastered the concept, then I don't think you need to force them to. But when we look at our math data, I don't feel comfortable saying that we have a huge number of students in our building who should not be building to show their work. They should be able to demonstrate that they understand the concept and the use of the manipulatives. So that question kind of raised a red flag to me. So I think that's something we need to kind of keep our eyes out for when we're talking with teachers, and also when we're in the classrooms watching what they're doing as far as having the children to use the manipulatives. Do they truly know that the child is developmentally beyond concrete? When we look at our overall data, being a 16%, I can't comfortably say the the mass majority of the teachers in this building should not be using manipulatives, and I'm not saying that's what they're doing, but I'm just using that as an extreme example.
Could we?
But you also think about, even with the benchmarks, because K1 and 2 can use manipulatives on the benchmark.
Mhm.
So if the kid has never had access to it, they wouldn't know how to use it correctly when it's time to actually manipulate it for the test either.
Right.
Well, and we had a conversation with third grade yesterday about how, the students didn't even use the representational aspect of it because they didn't write on their
Yeah,
paper,
they
they didn't use their paper, they didn't write in a book, they didn't do any of that, so I think you're right, we still, to me, I would ask the question, how do you know where your students are with CRA? Like, for the most, obviously, some kids are gonna be, a child might be in base 10 at abstract, and fractions, they might be at manipulatives, that just depends on what the content is, but how do you know where they are? What did you?
I'm gonna use that question. I've got PLCs coming up April 2nd, so I'll start off the sessions with a little survey, that'll tap into that question.
And I was gonna say too, one of my hindsight thoughts from that was, is it challenging the student enough then? If they don't need the concrete representation, should the
That's good.
question not be harder then?
So are you differentiating for that
Uh-huh.
student? So that's good.
That's how it was, I agree with it, all goes back to the comfort level of the person that's actually doing the lesson.
Yes.
And if we're not comfortable with it, we're not gonna make sure that the kids are comfortable with it either.
And I've also been, I just thought about the fourth grade, well, I actually did hers using the rubric, and that's the next piece that we kinda need to talk about also. I'm gonna put a little note here to go back to see what we've noticed with the use of Freckle. We need to have our data to support our observations, and I did a rubric. So we're doing this now, okay, the artifacts. I created a rubric that's similar to the one that I did for the lesson plans, problem of the day, number talks. I made one for problem of the day with manipulatives and put strategic PLC in front of it. When we come back for our next time, we'll continue to start off with an update or a review, but the piece that we need would be the data, the hardcore data of what you saw when you were in the classroom. So we can take that data and make different graphs and charts and representations that'll show us the trends that we see in grade levels or trends that we see in the school as a whole. And then that'll help us to better prepare a plan of the areas that we need to target for the grade levels who may need additional assistance. I'm almost embarrassed now. Don't look, there's some key. So this is what the strategic problem solving or problem of the day rubric will look like if you want to use this. Does everyone feel comfortable with using the Google Doc, like for the observations?
That email address, that's your email address, or is it the teacher's email address?
The teacher's email address.
Okay.
For the ones that I was using like this for the lesson plans, once you put the teacher's email address in, it'll email them a copy, so they'll get feedback before you even leave their classroom.
Now, is this one of the links that you had in leadership team notes a while back?
I'm not sure if it was in leadership.
Like
It's
Tim.
similar to the one she had,
Okay.
the,
So will you be able to access it through?
Like,
The
I'm just trying to
slash?
figure out how do I access this link? Is it in Google Drive?
Yes.
Cause you may have talked about it prior to me joining.
Yes, and let me make sure I didn't put it in my, folder,
Okay.
and make sure that it is in a shared folder, so I'll check on that.
it is, cause I accessed it.
I think it's
Did you
just
see
because
it?
I've joined after,
Oh, maybe.
like, so I don't know
Okay, you may not have
from where
access.
I should access the link
Okay,
or to
I'll
find
make
that.
sure.
Could you email us the link again?
Yes. So once we use the link or the rubric to do the walkthrough, when we come back, we'll be able to look at, like I said, the trends in the school as a whole, and then the trends within the grade level. And then that'll give us some hardcore data to help drive our planning. Now, before we move on to where we are now, we're moving to next with best practices, Freckle usage. And we can access the reports, and I've looked at some of the reports, looking at usage and the growth as a school. But when we were talking before, we were looking at, and I guess we could use the reports for that information also, but we talked about going in, looking at the students using Freckle and looking to see if they were using manipulatives when they're using Freckle. Let me think back.
From what I've seen, they're not. Same for paper.
I've seen the use of
Paper and
Freckle,
pencil.
but not the use of manipulatives.
Yeah.
Nothing right now, cause I have to hunt and pick and see which way I went to. And I actually was looking when I took David to the hospital one night, was in there going through the missing organ. Before I move on, I'm taking myself back to remember if we talked about them using manipulatives, or
Paper,
we
pencil.
actually talked about them using paper and pencil
Yeah.
to work out the problems.
I think paper, I don't know if we talked about
So,
manipulatives, but paper,
right, the
pencil, absolutely.
manipulatives were with the journals. Them using Freckle was them writing out the problems, because April asked the question if they were to write their problems out with paper pencil. And on some of the screens, depending on the problem, they can work it out on the screen. But then after our discussion with third grade again yesterday and seeing what they did on that benchmark, barely even touching that notebook paper. So with third grade, we've said, and we're gonna try to make this consistent throughout the school, even with Freckle, they need paper and pencil. And it's kind of odd to see that the students are doing their math journals almost every single day, and they have to write the equation, they have to show a visual representation, and they have to write a sentence as to how they got to their answer. And then with the benchmark,
There's no training.
all they have to really do is write out how they solve the problem. So there's a gap, there's something missing. They're not applying what they've done so that it transfer to, okay, I can use these steps. So we're gonna have to find a way to kind of close that gap. There's a missing piece there, the link is not flowing. And one suggestion that the third grade team made, and we sent out those notes, is that anytime the leadership team is walking through, and if we happen to see the students doing their problem-solving journal, ask them, or even with Freckle, are you working out your problem? Are you showing your work? The chart that we created when they were in here, we said, preach, show your work. So it should be system-wide, all the students in here should be used to hearing, are you showing your work, showing your work? You have to show your work, it's not an estimation contest. So that's a third grade need that we discovered in talking with them in planning yesterday, and there's also a school-wide need.
To look at, to kind of go back a little bit, when you talk about the problem of the day, especially with fifth grade, was it mentioned to them how some of their problems the other day need to have like graded response, and for them to look at it from that way as well?
No, we have not
Okay.
said that, I don't think specifically to fifth grade.
Okay,
I think Ms. Bryant has mentioned it
okay.
a couple of times.
That would be good, because they have a little more exposure to it.
Right.
I wanna say they're doing some journal things with, I feel like I've seen, things in the writing journal, but that would be from, would that be?
For math, you're talking about?
In graded response, but.
I haven't
could be
seen
wrong.
graded response. They may have, and I may just have missed that day, but I haven't seen graded response.
That might be a suggestion for them too, to kind of implement that as well. Because in looking at the answer sheets, especially for the kids who, had like marking book or things like that, for them to actually, because it's like a white square and a gray, they felt like they only supposed to mark in the white, and then they only bubble in the white columns, and so then therefore, you know, those things as well. But at least if they do it with problem of the day as well, they're getting it both ways.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're good on our student focused portion. Okay, so where we're moving to now is looking at the teachers, and we started it today, looking at teacher leadership, completing the survey this morning, and the questions that we used had to be research-based questions, and based on the state that we were in, I was able to use questions that came from the teacher's working condition survey. And I meant to say that because some of them may have thought, oh, these look familiar, so we had to use questions that were research-based. We didn't have to use all of them, we had a certain number that we could use. I used a little bit more than we had to, but I think we need that information and that data. So where we are now, when we think about the mentoring stage and working with teachers, the first stage is where a lot of teachers were at the beginning of the year, learning about the school, learning how to organize their classrooms, learning what resources I have available. The second stage was them working on the actual teaching of what they're doing and working on their classroom management skills. And just like with the students, we have teachers that are in different stages and in different levels. But where we are focusing now is looking at the teachers understanding the instructional strategies. What strategies are you using to teach? When we first started looking at instructional strategies at my previous school, that was hard for teachers. We had to do sessions on what is an instructional strategy. You're putting in your plans what you're doing, but you're not telling the strategy of how you're going to teach that. So we're going to be working on implementing those pieces through the teachers working on best practices with their instructional practices as well as professional development. There's a best practice rubric that looks similar to the other rubrics that we'll use to do walkthroughs. I have like a tentative plan of what's on the walkthrough tool for best practices. We need to discuss how we're gonna lay that out. We started with the focus on the student. Now that we're moving to focusing on the teacher, this student focus doesn't go away. So we're still monitoring our students with the first focus that we had, but now we're moving to best practices. I don't want what we're doing to become overwhelming and we're not able to effectively do the pieces that we're looking at as far as the student versus the teacher. So we want to continue the work that we just discussed with the student, but now we're gonna have to fold in looking at the instructional practices in the school. So if the plan or process that I have can be done a different way, or could be done a way that will be more feasible for the group, then y'all share that so we can come up with a plan that's gonna work for everybody. So I did a rubric looking at best practices, similar to the one that we just looked at. And then looking at creating the rubric, I looked at a lot of different resources during our research. And a lot of it came from Marzano, looking at Marzano's high yield strategies, looking at how the teachers should be teaching, and then the sample of evidence that we should see when we're in the classrooms. That may be a little hard to see. Here's a printed out copy if you're taking my pass it around. So this specific domain that I was looking at is domain 2. Looking to make sure that we have a clear vision of how instruction should be implemented within the classroom. That top portion is just a rating scale. I'll give you a few seconds to look over that. And then that bottom portion, what evidence should we see to show that we're leading our teachers to work on these best practices, including PD, observations, so kind of glance at the sample evidence that we should be seeing.
Something that the teacher-led design team could help us with too.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can start the PD with the teachers on best practices. When the April 2nd date that I have coming up will be a focus on the standards based on the clusters that they're in per grade level. So within the standards, the activities that I share with them will be best practices, so it'll be twofold. Some of the evidence talks about having a clear plan. So after the PD session that we have on best practices, then I'll create a written document based on our conversation and what we discuss, and each teacher will be able to have access to that plan so that they'll know what we're looking for. That I'll share the rubric with them so that they'll see the rubric. When we go in for observations, these observations have to be a 15-minute chunk. It's not one of the 3 to 5 minute walkthroughs. So the observations that I do for best practices will be a 15-minute block of time. Also, when we do observations, we can decide as a team if we want to focus first on looking at the high yield strategy that has the most gains, which is tracking student progress and scoring skills. I'm going to show you another document too that we can just kind of flow through quickly, but students should know how they're performing in class. They should know, they should be accountable for what they are learning. They should be able to track and what their scores are, and they have student data notebooks, but I'm not too sure of where we are in the implementation of that. But the graph that you're looking at now shows the high yield strategies, and then it shows which strategies has the highest percentage of gain once those strategies are implemented. So I'm thinking we'll start with the ones that has the highest gain. And we see that students tracking their own progress. That can be as simple as a chart with them keeping up with their mastery. And we have the math pledge cards.
Everybody has a data notebook too.
I think our need or our growth point as a school is consistency. We'll have good ideas, and when I say we, I'm in that boat, the we boat. We'll have ideas, but being able to consistently implement those ideas. When I was pulling students for testing, I stopped by and tried to check the ones that I've had, whether they were with my assigned grade level or not. And if they knew the count bys, I would try to check them off. But it's happened, the students that I've had, I couldn't check them off because they hadn't mastered the count bys from 2s to 20 or whatever the grade level had. So we have some things in place, but I think we need to zero in on how can we consistently implement these practices in a way that is feasible for everyone. So that's something to kind of think about on the back burner, is consistency with implementing practices.
That goes back to a written document articulating the school-wide model of instruction being in place. That's number 1 here. So if we have written out, and not just this part, but everything, then we can stick to it.
So that they see a written plan and they also hear it. Summarizing that strategy, we see that it's 19%. That's a strategy that Dr. Watkins has talked a lot about also. So that's one of the higher strategies. Setting goals and objectives. When I look at that best practice, there was a time where the teachers had to list their essential questions, their goals of the day, what they were focusing on. We used to have to list our schedule on the board. That way the students knew what was coming for the day, they knew what was expected, but then, of course, in reading the research, there was a reminder, it does no good, almost like an anchor chart or a word wall, if you've got your essential questions listed or your I can statements and you never refer to them. So we can't just say, let's put these things in place. We're gonna have to kind of help guide the teachers through how to put these practices in place and be able to maintain consistency with it. I know this is the time of the year that teachers feel overwhelmed. They feel like, don't give me anything else. Don't show me anything else. With the Greg Tang Math Madness Challenge that Greg Tang was doing for March, it was one of the easiest challenges that you could ever see. It was all games, and the kindergarten version was as simple as play this game, put down your favorite game. Play this game, put down your favorite game. And maybe if the teachers had seen that, I don't know, in the video, or if they'd seen it in a staff meeting, or maybe even in PLCs, but nobody wanted to really hear about it. But it was all, everything was there, certificates, and it was like a ready-made plan. So in thinking about teachers jumping on board with doing something like that versus doing the implementation of the best practices, there has to be a plan where they understand this is a part of what we should be doing. It's a part of what we need to be doing to increase student achievement. And in my mind, I'm thinking about the PD part of it, the rollout part of it. I don't want it to be something that we say and not be able to effectively put these practices into place. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think like we talked about in teacher-led design team earlier, was it needs to come from them and more so from the teachers, because once those teachers are, spreading that word, this is, this is what we're gonna do, this is big, and this is why we're doing it, that's gonna help give ownership maybe to the teachers.
That's huge. That makes me think about another piece that we talked about in our research. The paper that we did, it talked about building teacher efficacy, looking at the teacher leaders, giving the teacher leaders the leadership role so that the other teachers will see what they're doing and jump on board. So would it be advantageous to do a joint meeting with the teacher-led design team and the strategic PLC? Okay, so maybe I could think about how to flesh that out. I know they have their objectives that they're focusing on, but if we're all working towards the same goal and what we're working on can be merged together, we won't have a disjointed team over here and a disjointed team over here. We can be on the same team, so to speak. Not to say that every meeting we have will be with the teacher-led design team, but we'll look at that. And just picking out the top best practices that we'll look at, it makes me kind of think about revising the rubric. But go
And
ahead.
then even looking at cause you got 3 that are right there at like 20, the interactive games, the similarities and differences, but that building vocabulary is important because that's where they struggle. They don't, when they see a word, don't know the word, so we're just gonna guess as what it may be. And that's definitely evident in their math problems, their word problems, because they'll start adding stuff and it has nothing to do with addition. But because they don't know certain vocabulary words that's connected with the operations, then they see 2 numbers, I'm automatically gonna add, I'm gonna subtract. I'm not gonna try to figure out if it's a multi-step word problem, I'm not gonna do any of that. But the building vocabulary is definitely very important, is what I think.
Laura,
Okay.
didn't you say
Now.
something about the Title I survey? There was something about vocabulary on there.
Okay, was it 3rd grade maybe? No, somebody mentioned, it may have been 3rd grade, during one of the planning this week, someone said that vocabulary, one of the grade levels brought up that vocabulary was really hard.
That might be
Was something they were struggling with, I can't
Okay.
remember which grade it was.
So what we'll do, I'll revise the rubric that I did, and we'll target a specific number of these best practices, and then that's what we'll focus on first. I heard vocabulary. What else are you thinking?
Definitely the goal setting and objectives, because if the kids know what they're working toward,
Okay.
they'll know where they're supposed to be.
And that's a piece of those data notebooks if we
Right,
use them
right.
properly, I guess.
And I also up there, I think, even though it's only has a 4 up there, the feedback. To give them feedback on what they're doing right or what they're not doing right. because then they can automatically jump on it instead of waiting like weeks at a time before you even address it, to give that immediate feedback, so they can actually see it.
And if you look at Hattie's effect size and with strategies, I think feedback is one of the
Higher ones.
higher ones.
I definitely,
John Hattie's work.
Okay, so can we agree to look at building vocabulary, goal setting and objectives, and then feedback? Okay, that's good, because then it won't be so overwhelming when we look at best practices.
and all of them tie together, because then if I say, you know, if I set a goal and say I should know a certain amount of math vocabulary words, then I'm setting a goal, I'm hitting vocabulary, and all of that is tied right there together instead of all these separate entities.
Okay, perfect.
Should we add tracking and then also tracking the progress towards their goal?
Yeah, cause that could be
first one,
simple as
yeah.
a chart,
Okay.
that could just be a chart and
Kind of
making
tie
sure,
together, is that
yeah,
tracking goals,
Mhm.
Progress towards
or
their goal.
setting goals and tracking them, or
Right.
whatever. Yeah, definitely.
cause the kids truly like to see when their bars grow. Like if I start and I know the first month I only knew 2, and then the next time I get to track it I see 10, I'm like, man, I did something good. I'm actually on the right track. So
Yeah.
That
They
was a
really
huge
do.
part in my data notebooks last year.
Yeah.
The tracking of
they like to see
how
that.
close they're getting to their goal,
They like to
what
see
they
that.
need to do
Well, it's
to
like
improve.
when you're on a diet. If you're not getting on the scale, you don't know what you can for your clothes.
So yeah, I think those are they all tie together, and it's not 4 different things.
That's good.
They can all
I
go
feel good
together.
with that. Okay, I like that. That's good. Alright, so that just listed the best practices separately. There's another article that you can access later. There's a link, and it talks about tips of how to implement the different best practices. So I'll look at the tips and look at the ones that specifically for what we've listed, and make sure that's a part of the PD that I do with the teachers April 2nd when we look at the best practices. You gonna say something, April? Okay. We already looked at that. That was the rubric. We pretty much touched on just about all of these points on this slide through our discussions. Providing feedback through the rubrics that we use so that we'll have hardcore data when we come in here. Making sure that our feedback is some that we can continue, or that we've got a plan that everybody feels comfortable with using that rubric. The next step we won't do that today, but to set some SMART goals. We filled out a SMART goal sheet when we were focusing on the students. So we'll look at what our goals will be based on the best practices that we chose. We'll put down some dates as far as the time frames that we want to work within those SMART goals. And we'll also list who's responsible, and it's usually our whole team who's responsible for the goals that we set. So we'll look at that during our next meeting, and we'll plan that for next Friday. I have not looked at the calendar yet, but I'll make sure that the calendar is clear, and then I'll send out an invitation, and we'll meet next Friday. The staff training on best practices will be done during the April 2nd PD. I'll merge the standards and activities based on their clusters with what we've discussed today. And the last bullet talks about embedded PD versus other options. PD in the days of the way that I did it when I first became a coach, we had full staff PD after school, 1 hour a day, the second Monday of the month. That PD is not necessarily best practices right now. The best practice kind of PD is what we're doing now. Going into the classrooms, modeling for the teachers, then co-teaching with the teachers, and then going back to observe them and give them feedback. And teachers are in different places. Some teachers will say, well, I think I'm doing a pretty good job. Can you just come in to observe me? I don't need a model lesson. So the embedded PD is more of the best practices PD that we're trying to implement here at North. So we'll continue to do that and continue to work with teachers, and we'll still do some, that's debatable, that we might need to discuss that. We were doing the after school Wednesday sessions that were the optional sessions for teachers to come in. But 9 times out of 10, when you look at the data of who comes, nobody really comes. So we'll probably kind of stick more with the embedded PD. Yeah. Any questions, comments, concerns, overall feedback?
I think that's good. Maybe not for this year, but next year when you're doing the building vocabulary, I'd like to take some of the, advanced Gordon Gillingham, concepts and start infusing them into at least starting with first, second, all the way up, because I feel like they definitely will benefit from those prefixes, suffixes, Greek and Latin roots.
That's good.
And I also think when you hit the vocabulary piece, when you look at the math content, how the words can go across different content areas.
Mhm.
So to make sure that our literacy is hitting on it and our social studies and science, that it's not just being heard in math, that it's actually across the board, because they're hearing it and they're seeing it in all of the classes that they go to, because you know we have to hear more than once in order for us to get it. And if they're actually applying that in the other subject areas, especially science, when you're doing your science labs and things like that, they're still getting an understanding of the vocabulary. You know, they get to see what it looks like in both content areas, and they have a better understanding of it when it's time to apply it.
That's a good point. That's huge. That way they're not seeing the words just in isolation.
Right.
They think that word just belongs in the math box.
Right.
Vocabulary does a good job at showing it switching between content areas too, using the math vocabulary and real world concepts.
Mhm. I think that's a piece that's missing.
That's good. Anything else for the good of the group? If not, meeting's adjourned.
I've noticed it about 5 times, and
Thank
I'm
you,
happy to
ladies.
say,
Thank you, thank you.